Story 1. Still don't know what that was. When I was in high school, I always was walking around my town after at night, whether it be with friends or by myself, and was supposed to be home around 9. I lived in a pretty small neighborhood where there was often a lot of sketchy people walking around at night, so I never took the same route home at the end of the night. One night when I was 14, I was walking past this old historical building that used to be a hotel and is just kinda creepy. As I was walking, I got a phone call from an unknown number. My friends and I were always prank calling each other, so I answered it. The voice was really deep and honestly scared me because it didn't sound like anything my friends could try to mimic, but I figured it was a prank, so I was looking around as they're saying creepy stuff like, "I'm right behind you, I'm watching you." There was literally no one there. The cars were all just the ones that were always there from the few people that lived on the street, and it was a very open street with not a lot of places to hide behind that anyone could have been watching me without me seeing them. I hung up and kept walking, thinking it was one of my friends, when I got another call, just like before, a weird voice, but this time was laughing. I was trying to figure out who it was, but I got annoyed, so I hung up again, thinking one of my friends would hang up later. Then my phone rang again, but when I went to answer it, my phone wasn't ringing and it sounded like it was actually coming from the bush next to me, which was too small for someone to be hiding in. I didn't have one of the regular iPhone ringtones, it was a specific one I had bought, so I knew it was mine. I booked it and ran home. I texted all my friends telling them whoever it wasn't funny. None of them went up to it, and when I thought about it, I never took the same way home or even went home at the same time, so no one could have planned that, and with the ringtone and everything, none of it made sense. To this day I don't know what it was, but any time I'm home and I drive past that building I think of it. Anyone have any thoughts on what that could have been? Story 2. Never want to be alone again. I used to love being home alone. It gave me freedom during a time I had none. My parents were very strict, limiting most of the things I was able to do. I never felt like a teenager, but rather a kid with all the restrictions that were put in place. But when I was home alone, I was able to circumvent that. It made me feel better about myself. But even with all the freedom I could receive being home alone, I never want to be home alone ever again after my last experience. Here's some quick context before I get into my story. I grew up in a rural neighborhood, with streets lined with houses. However, they weren't amazing quality, and most of them looked old and worn out by the Canadian weather. But the houses had matched the quality of the people living in them. All houses resided by people without hope of ever leaving this shitty town. So with all the hopeless people, there were an equal amount of depraved people. My house itself consists of a main floor and basement. There was a large window near the front door that viewed the street. There was also a back door that was at the head of the basement stairs. In the basement was a small gaming room which had with a very small window that faced the sidewalk that led to the back porch, which led to the back door. Now I was roughly 14 at the time of the story. It was later at night, roughly 6 o'clock, and I was walking home from school swiftly, knowing my parents wouldn't be home until late that evening. As cliche as it sounds, it was rainy weather. The rain pitter-pattered down on my raincoat, making a relaxing sound that put my mind at ease after a long day of classes. With that in mind, I wasn't focused on my surroundings, which later came back to bite me. Little did I know that there was someone following me home from school. The first time I recognized it from my rather zen state was when there was a flash that had come from behind me. When I turned around to see where it came from, I had caught a glimpse of a silhouette that was just outside of the streetlight behind me. I had jumped a little and had gotten goosebumps, but I thought that this was just another person going home, just like me. As I continued on my way home, I was made semi-aware of my surrounding, as there was a second shadow that seemed to follow me. I didn't truly get paranoid until I turned onto my street and the guy had still followed me. I turned into the driveway to my house, getting ready to sprint if I had to. My heart rate increased, especially knowing the area I lived in. But as I walked up the patio stairs, he had continued on. I still opened the door as fast as possible and locked it as I peered through the front window to catch another glimpse of the guy who seemed to be following me. This time I saw that he was wearing a black hoodie with the hood up. He had a red trucker cap that I could see peek out of from under the hood. He also wore blue acid wash jeans and black boots. Soon, he walked out of my sight. At that point I had began to calm down and thought that I had overreacted, somewhat embarrassed by how paranoid I was about some random guy. So I pushed the experience out of my mind as I booted up my Xbox and stole the controller for it from out my parents' room. I started playing games in the basement, wearing only one half of my headphones just in case my parents came home early. Thank God I did. I was roughly 30 minutes into playing when I heard steps outside the basement window. Thinking it was my parents, I quickly turned off the Xbox and threw the controller under my chair and bolted upstairs to try and pretend like I was doing work. When something felt off. The footsteps did not match up correctly. I know it may sound strange, but I know exactly how my parents' footsteps sound. So not only was there only one set of footsteps, but they didn't sound right. I didn't immediately think it was the same guy from earlier, but instead I had believed that it was a confused mailman. Stupid me, I know. So halfway up the stairs I had slowed my pace to a near halt and creeped up to the back door. There was patterned glass on the back door window, so I couldn't truly see out of it. Only shadows. The shadow was all I needed to start feeling fear creep over my body. My hair stood up as I waited for this person to either ring the doorbell or knock. I waited a full minute and nothing changed. No sound until I saw the doorknob turn and my stomach churned. I didn't remember ever locking the back door. But as the full rotation was completed, the door didn't open. I sighed but started to panic, knowing that this was probably not my parents or a confused mailman. I was considering calling the cops, but instead I tried to get a view of the person before I did anything too crazy, hoping maybe it was a family member or friend stooping by. The only window that could see out to the back door was the window in my room, which in turn was halfway across the house from where I was. So I silently walked into my room and looked out the window when I realized the guy wasn't there. My mind was racing, but my fears would soon be valid as I heard the back door slam shut. Now we had two phones in the house. One in the front living room by the front door and another one in the basement. Now I had no clue which direction this man was going. I could only hear light steps every once in a while when he stepped on a creaky floorboard. So I had slowly looked down the hallway to the kitchen near the back door to see if I could see this man. I started to breathe more rapidly as I got closer to where he could have been. The dim kitchen light did not reveal any shadows, so I slowly crept down the hallway trying to get in the living room to get the closest phone. As I started to turn the corner into that room, I saw him. His back hood was down, but the red trucker cap was noticeable. He was looking between the two couches that faced the living room window. I continued to watch him as I saw him pick up the phone, throw it on the ground, and stomp on it. My legs became wobbly as I had walked by the doorway to try and head into the basement. As much as I tried to avoid the creaky floorboards, it wasn't good enough, and as I reached the first set of stairs to the basement, he must have heard me as I can hear him starting to run toward me. I bolted down the stairs, nearly falling a few times, when I found the phone and locked myself in the dark, dirty laundry room. I was able to lose him slightly, and he didn't know the room I went into. I immediately called the police and whispered the problem as I heard him open some of the doors in the basement, trying to find me. The operator said an officer would be to my house in 10 minutes. I wanted to scream at the operator to tell them to move faster, but I knew it wouldn't help. The operator told me to stay on the line as I tried to find some weapon to defend myself. At that moment, there was none. I was stuck in the laundry room, without any weapons, any escape, and the police being farther away as the man got closer. He finally reached the laundry room door and tried the handle. He started furiously pressing down on it. I heard him start to bash on the door with his fist, yelling at me to open the door. After a minute or two, he started kicking it, and the door flexed with every kick. Kick after kick after kick, I could tell the door was going to come down any moment. I looked around and tried to find an escape, but there was none. When finally I heard police cars roll up into the driveway and the kicking stopped. I heard the man turn around and rush upstairs out the back door, slamming it behind him. I waited, shaking lightly, as I moved to the far corner of that room, trying to hide on the shadows in case he came back. Finally, I heard a light knock on the door, and I was told by a gruff-sounding voice that he was a police officer and that I could leave the room. Once I had gotten confirmation from the operator, I ended the call and left the room. As I left the basement, I was told to wait near a police car so they could get my account of what happened. 3 of the 4 police officers checked the property as one took my statement. Just as I thought the whole thing was done, I heard one of the officers yell something. The yelling in volume increased until it stopped suddenly. After a couple passed, the officer came back to the police car with a man in handcuffs. The red trucker cap made it obvious of who it was. The man was older with a gray beard and wrinkles around his face. The first time I saw the man, and he looked at me with a death stare. I couldn't help but to do one back and ball up my fists. I gritted my teeth trying to hold back anger this guy had implanted into my head. Once he was in the police car, 2 officers drive off while the other waited with me until my parents came home. Days later, when revisiting the same topic with my parents, the man was found with a switchblade, a plastic bag, a small bag of cocaine, and finally a camera with a picture of me on my home from that night as well as the house on the same night. Later we found out that he had done this twice before and had critically injured one boy my age by stabbing him with the same switchblade he had on his person. So let's just say, I never want to be home alone again. Story 3. I used to work at a haunted hotel. I started working there the summer I finished school. I'd gotten my A-level results, and I have to admit, I hadn't put in enough work for them. I'd skipped 2 C's and a D barely passes, and not good enough to get into any of the universities I'd applied for. My mom was disappointed in me, surprise, surprise, and gave me 2 options: try and get a uni place through clearing, or get a job and pay her rent until I could afford to move out. Obviously, I picked the latter. The hotel was called Rainnco and was less than an hour's drive from home. I was interviewed by a short balding man with tired eyes and a weirdly pink scalp, as if his hair had been pulled and not fallen out naturally. He introduced himself as Ned and seemed eager for me to start. I'd been a little suspicious of this, at first, in case the desperation for staff was something I should be concerned about. God, I wished I'd listened to my gut. Rainnco itself was less of an eyesore than you'd expect. It had 5 floors, with 24 rooms on each, splitting off of snaking corridors, carpeted and wallpapered in fading shades of red and brown. Each room was basic: double bed, ensuite bathroom, closet, desk, heater, and full-length mirror. Strangely, none of the rooms seemed to have windows, despite the fact many of them had external walls, and the building itself appeared to have windows from the outside. At first, the experiences were minor. The front desk phone would ring, and when I'd answer, no one would be on the other end. Requests would come in from rooms for extra towels, or to make a complaint about something not working, only for the room to be empty when I get there. Freshly replaced light bulbs would burst within hours. Random objects would seemingly disappear and then reappear again in the most obvious of places. Of course, I was nervous to start with, caught off guard by these strange happenings. Being the youngest and newest staff member, I was hesitant to mention anything to any of my coworkers, in case they laughed at me or brushed me off as some anxious kid. It wasn't until my 3rd month on the job that things began to ramp up a little. It was past 2 a.m. and I had been sitting in the back office with the door open in case anyone came to the front desk when an animalistic shriek rang out through the lobby. I sat bolt upright in my chair, needle-like prickles running down my spine. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. I knew I should check the lobby, but the dread creeping over me told me I should hide and definitely not go investigate. Choosing my job duties over my fear, I crept out of the office and into the reception area. Everything was as still and quiet as it should be. Part of me desperately wanted to slip back into the room behind me and lock the door, but instead, I picked up my flashlight and skeleton keys and started making rounds through each floor, poking my head into every unoccupied room and darkened stairwell. I found nothing. After that, I couldn't seem to go a week without hearing the scream during a night shift. Oftentimes, when I worked a morning shift, guests would come by the reception on their way to breakfast and complain about seeing someone in their room the night before. They usually described a dark figure, with a slim build, standing in their room, blocking the door, or looming over them before fading into nothing. These sightings only seem to happen on floors 2 and 4, most frequently in rooms 2, 7, 15, 19, 21, and 23, and more often than not, with women. Every time I was sent to clean one of these rooms, I would try to wrangle someone else into coming with me, not because I was lazy, but because I hated being in those rooms alone. But normally, there weren't enough workers on shift to allow 2 people to go do a single-person job. It would be fine when I'd first enter the room, but the longer I'd be in there, the seemingly heavier the atmosphere would get. I'd feel like someone was staring at me constantly, a pressure building in my head until a migraine would begin to burn behind my eyes. Plus, I could guarantee I'd lose something every time I cleaned one of those rooms. Even if I had emptied all of my personal effects before I entered, I'd leave unable to find a spray bottle, a cloth, or on one occasion, my whole belt. Of course, there were lots of smaller happenings, too, just like any haunted place. Hanging lights would swing with no breeze, doors would open by themselves, the front desk bell would ring with nobody around, clatters and bangs would emanate from the kitchen hours after it had closed for the night, an invisible something would tug sharply on my hair and clothes, as well as trip me up. Honestly, whilst it did all freak me out, I just put up with it. Yes, I was struggling to get more than 5 hours of sleep a night, and my mental state had definitely taken a toll, but for some reason, the idea of quitting hadn't really crossed my mind, other than in the form of a fleeting thought. I was oddly drawn to the hotel, as if under some kind of spell or curse. Almost like I couldn't leave. The final straw, however, was when the apparitions started appearing. I don't count the shadow man on floors 2 and 4, as I never actually saw anything myself. The first one was a woman, dressed in muddy gray, crying in the lobby. It had been another tiresome night shift, and my nerves already felt frayed by 3 a.m. when the sound of someone sobbing rang out through the reception area. I rushed out to the front desk, heart pounding and desperately hoping whoever was there was okay and uninjured. Sitting in the middle of the maroon carpet was a woman in a dirty gray tracksuit. The fabric was torn at the knees, and I could clearly see blood seeping through the ragged edges. Her face was buried in her hands, her dark hair spilling like waterfalls over her trembling shoulders. I approached and tentatively touched her upper back in an attempt at comfort. I was 19 at this point, and while I like to think of myself as pretty socially competent, consoling a crying adult was still beyond me. "Ma'am, what's wrong? Has something happened?" I lowered myself and allowed my full palm to make contact with her shoulder blade. A grotesque shudder ran through her body, almost like a convulsion. She began to rise, sitting up more fully and turning towards me. Then she pulled her hands away from her face, and I recoiled in horror. It couldn't even be said she had a face anymore, really just a gaping maw where her lips should meet over her teeth, below a ripped nose and eye sockets filled with some kind of goo. The jagged teeth wrenched further apart as a scream erupted from the thing's throat, and I flinched back, shielding myself from the sight. After several agonizingly long seconds, I peeked through my fingers and found she had vanished, leaving me cowering on the old carpet alone. Once the floodgate opened to them, they never seemed to stop. A couple of days ago, I posted some of my experiences in a haunted hotel I used to work at. Well, I've quite a few questions and suggestions, so I figured I'd do some digging and asking and see what more I can trudge up about the place. I'll be honest, working at that place fucked me up a bit, and writing this all down is definitely bringing it back, but maybe it'll help. Catharsis, therapy, or something. Firstly, to answer a few people's questions, I didn't really discuss the happenings with my coworkers. It was just one of those unsaid things that everyone experienced but nobody wanted to talk about. Like I said before, I felt almost trapped there, and maybe that's what made us all keep relatively quiet about it all. That being said, there were a few euphemistic exchanges about the activity. Stuff like, "Floor 2 seemed to have lots of visitors last night," or "Would you mind coming with me to clean this room?" Always gives me the creeps. But never really anything deeper. Someone suggested messaging a couple of my old coworkers, and after some digging, stalking, through Facebook, I managed to find a few. Only 2 got back to me, but I can't really say I'm surprised. if one of them had messaged me asking about the old hotel, I'd be a bit suspicious, not to mention apprehensive, to respond, too. One of them, who often worked alongside me on shifts, but we didn't really go much beyond small talk about music taste, pets, and TV shows, said she used to hate cleaning on floors 2 and 4, too. She was concerned it was just her imagining things, so never thought to mention it, for fear of being thought of as crazy. She said on more than one occurrence, in one of those rooms, she'd catch a dark shape flicker through the edge of her vision. The other coworker who responded is a similar age to me. He joined not long before I left, so whilst I didn't interact with him too much, we did talk a little on shift, mostly due to being the youngest workers. He said he'd also seen the crying apparition, but not as intensely as I did. Apparently, he'd been on the first floor, cleaning in the corridors, when he'd heard her crying and had gone to investigate. As he came down the stairs, he walked towards her from the side but stopped dead when he spotted dark blood leaking out from between her fingers and where her palms were pressed against what should have been her face. At that point, he just noped out, turned around, and headed back upstairs. He quit a month or two later as he was leaving for university. Some of you wanted to hear about some other experiences I had there, so I've managed to compile a bit of a list of some of the other activities. The lift would play up, seemingly getting stuck on the 3rd floor. No matter what button you pressed, it would stop at the 3rd floor. Even if you closed the doors and pressed another floor button, the elevator would seemingly move and then stop at the 3rd floor again. The lift would bleed from time to time. I don't mean like the Shining style blood flowing out the lift doors when you called it to your floor. I mean like, you'd be standing in it and something would drip on you. You'd wipe your face and find blood. Looking up at the ceiling, there'd be fat droplets seemingly dripping from the metal paneled ceiling and running in sluggish streams down the smeared walling. Certain rooms weren't ever occupied by guests, one which never seemed to heat up. There was always a light coating of frost on the inside of the windows and you could see your breath. We had a maintenance guy up there once, but he couldn't find anything technically wrong with the heaters. Another occupiable room was one where the lights refused to turn on. Again, nothing technically wrong with them, but the switches just didn't seem to work. The female coworker messaged and said she'd had an experience where the lights wouldn't turn off in there. I never experienced that myself, however. There were a couple of rooms where guests continually reported having their duvets yanked off them in the night, and often asked to switch rooms. I witnessed this a couple of times and they always had the same look in their eyes, like they didn't want to acknowledge that what they'd experienced might be something they couldn't just explain away. Speaking of which, Grimhale seemed to maintain majorly positive reviews, online or at least, that I could find. Even then, the more negative 3 stars and below reviews mostly targeted the food quality, service, or cleanliness rather than anything abnormal. Maybe, as an employee, I saw these hauntings all the time, but most guests only experienced a single event, at worst, and often just defaulted to explaining anything unusual away. I also messaged Ned, my ex-manager. I wasn't particularly hopeful he'd come back with anything useful. He was a nice enough guy while I worked there, but he often gave me the impression of being a skeptic and that anything abnormal was better off being ignored, else you were just inviting it to keep on doing whatever it was doing. His response was a little lackluster, but not surprising. Whilst he didn't actually tell me if he experienced anything himself, he did point me in the direction of some explanations for the things I'd seen. He gave me a list of case names, told me to do my own research, and asked that I don't try to contact him again regarding the hotel. Apparently, the female apparition I'd seen, the one in the lobby in gray, was a hit-and-run victim. She'd stayed at the hotel with her boyfriend, who dumped her and driven off in the car they'd arrived together in. He cheated on her with her best friend and she'd been sitting in the car park wretched and sobbing. She couldn't seem to get through to anyone for a lift and had resorted to attempting to hitchhike. She stepped a bit too far into the road, trying to get a passing driver's attention, and was caught by the vehicle. She somehow got caught in the tire or ripped part of the hubcap, I think, and had been dragged along the road, which tore off her face, shredding through her lips and splintering her teeth. By the time the driver noticed, it was beyond too late. Another case explained an apparition I saw on more than one occasion, a balding middle-aged man wandering around the halls. I never saw him in the same place twice, wrapped in a towel and shivering. The first time I saw him, I thought maybe he'd locked himself out of his room. He just stood there, glancing around anxiously and making these odd whimpers, like a kicked puppy. As I approached him, this overwhelming feeling of sadness washed over me. That's when I noticed the concerningly grayish-white tinge to his skin and the dark blood soaking his towel. It was streaked in huge patches, so brown it was almost black. I stopped dead and stared, wide-eyed and panicked. The man suddenly noticed my presence and jerked his head up in my direction. He moaned out something that sounded like "help me." His arm extended and I could see the tacky half-dry blood smeared down his forearm. I instinctually flinched back, and within a moment he had crumpled down to the floor, leaving nothing but a stained towel in the hallway. Every time I saw him after this, I asked him some variation of, "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" I remember seeing in some stupid ghost hunter show once that sometimes spirits are just souls trapped here, unable to move on, and all they need is someone to help them. I don't know whether I actually believe that about the souls and all, but I figured I had nothing to lose. Didn't ever stop me from seeing him, though. He always vanished the same way, crumpling down into the floor and leaving nothing but a dirty towel. According to the article I found, the guy had attempted to take his own life less than a year before I started working at the hotel, in his room. He'd stripped, climbed into the tub, and slit his wrists. Then, as he lay there, bleeding out into the water, I guess he changed his mind. He wrapped himself in a towel and tried to call the police, but by that time he'd lost a lot of blood. He lost consciousness before he could say anything more than "help me" to the operator. The worst apparitions, though, were the kids. They weren't covered in blood or had black demonic eyes. They just got to me in a way the adult apparitions didn't. Don't get me wrong, I was scared of the woman with no face, and the man in the towel always made me feel even more depressed than normal for the rest of the night. But the kids just got to me. I've always had a soft spot for them. I used to have a younger sister, but she died of cerebral palsy when she was 7 and I was 15, doing my GCSEs. There were 2 different child-aged apparitions, well, 3, technically. The first was a little girl in a pair of faded blue dungarees and a red striped top. Out of all the apparitions, I saw her the most. I'd notice her in the corner of my eye. She always made me jump, just standing there, hands clasped in front of her, watching me. She was small, skinny, and pale, no more than 6, I think, with mousy hair tied up in 2 pigtails on top of her head. Whenever I saw her, she wouldn't move, just stand there and watch me work. She wouldn't ever respond to anything I said either, and the one time I tried to approach her, she simply faded into the wall behind her when I got within a meter or 2. Of all the names Ned sent me, I couldn't manage to find anything on her even when I did my own research, trawling the internet for the history of the hotel. Nothing. The other one was a pair of kids who played in the stairwell. There was a boy, around 3 or 4, and a girl, about 8. They'd come running past me whenever I was going up and down the stairs, giggling and shrieking with laughter, their cheeks flushed and mouths wide with grins. To start with, it made me happy to see them. I was always on my way to check a room or clean something, and a break from all the other frightening and depressing occurrences in the hotel was very welcome. After all the negative energy, it was encouraging to see such carefree spirits. I was so enticed by their laughter and fun that I didn't even stop to consider why there were child apparitions playing in the stairwell. That was until one shift, Ned had asked me to clean the stairwell banisters. This particular stairwell stretched all the way from the ground floor lobby up to the 5th floor. I was up by the 4th floor, scrubbing the banister. Having started from the bottom, I was nearly done. The kids appeared when I reached just below the 3rd floor. Immediately, a smile formed on my face. I was glad of the pleasant company and entertainment. Around the 4th floor, though, was when it happened. A series of heavy thumps that seemed to go on far too long, then a loud and solid thud. I could hear the little girl's laughter dissolve into nervous giggles as her footsteps pattered down the wooden stairs. Panic bit into my heart and I stuck my head through the banisters, peering down. The girl screamed. My heart lurched. Even from the 4th floor, I could see how twisted the body of the little boy was. His limbs were bent at angles, and his head snapped back in an uncomfortable shape. Blood was already beginning to soak into the beige carpet around him. My hand flew to my mouth as nausea spiked in my stomach, rising up my throat at speed. I stumbled to my feet and flew up and out into the 4th floor corridor. I barely made it to the bathroom opposite the stairwell before my stomach emptied itself. I left early that day and called in sick for the rest of the week before handing in my notice. I lied and said I was having a hard time with all the responsibilities. I said I was leaving with immediate effect. Ned was pissed at me, but I didn't care. If I'd told him the truth, he probably would have understood and been sympathetic, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Maybe I was ashamed I'd broken so easily. I don't know. But all I could think about was the sickening thud that little boy made when he hit the floor, and why the little girl's spirit was stuck there, too. I haven't dared to research the case if there are even any articles about it online. I've got enough nightmare fuel already. I've moved on now, though. There's a local college that does online classes for adults and I've signed myself up. Once I've posted this, I'm going to start looking for flats nearby. Writing these things up has made me realize I need to get myself out of this depression rut and move on. Can't let myself be haunted by the past, not anymore. Thanks for listening. Please remember to subscribe.